Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, has one of the most dramatic settings in all of philosophical literature. It recounts the final hours in the life of Plato's mentor Socrates, who has been sentenced to death for corrupting the youth of Athens with his philosophical teachings. And the dialogue concludes with Socrates drinking the poisoned hemlock and slipping out of this life. The dialogue itself involves a robust series of arguments about the immortality of the soul. And toward the beginning, Socrates argues that the one aim of philosophy, when practiced in the proper manner, is to practice for dying and death. And it's true that throughout the history of philosophy, many philosophers have contemplated in profound and searching ways the nature of mortality, the question of whether death is to be feared, and how death shapes our sense of the meaning of our own lives. I'm very excited to share with you this 10-week online course that I've put together on the philosophy of death and dying. We're not going to actually read Plato's Phaedo, although I encourage you to read it. It's really great. But there are 10 other readings that I'm very excited to talk through with you. In the course, we're going to roughly look at 4 different themes or questions, although there's going to be a lot of overlap and we're not going to stick strictly to these 4 themes. But the first of them is the question of whether our death is something that we should fear or that is bad for us. And in the first week of the course, we're going to look at 2 Epicurean philosophers who argue that it isn't: the Greek philosopher Epicurus himself, as well as his later Roman follower Lucretius. Epicurus says, look, as long as you're alive, death hasn't affected you, so there's no reason to be afraid of it. And once you've died, you're not around to experience the badness of death, so there's nothing to be afraid of then either. Lucretius adds a further twist, and he says, why are you so horrified at the prospect of your non-existence after you die? After all, you didn't exist before you were born, and the thought of your pre-birth non-existence doesn't seem to fill you with horror either. The American philosopher Thomas Nagel pushes back against these Epicurean arguments, and we're going to see his argument for why death is in fact a bad thing in the second week. Nagel argues that these Epicurean arguments assume that something can only be bad for you if you experience its badness. And Nagel mounts a series of arguments to suggest that things can be bad for us even when we don't experience their badness. I won't experience my death, but the deprivation of life that it entails is still bad for me. At least that's what Nagel argues. And then in the third week, we're going to turn to the Chinese Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi, who in a series of bizarre and enriching anecdotes talks about death as one in a series of transformations, and that life is about transformation. And so this final transformation shouldn't trouble us any more than the other transformations that we encounter in life. In the second unit of the course, we're going to look at immortality and the question of whether immortality would be desirable. And we're going to start in the fourth week with an argument by the British philosopher Bernard Williams, who says that death and dying are indeed great deprivations of the goods of life, but there's something that would be even worse than dying, and that's not dying. Williams argues that creatures like ourselves with a finite personalities and a finite set of interests would find immortality unbearably tedious, and it's perhaps a small mercy that life does come to an end. In the fifth week, we're going to look at an argument by the philosopher Nick Bostrom, who thinks we've become too complacent about the idea of mortality, that we simply accept mortality as part of a bargain of being alive. But Bostrom is going to argue that in particular senescence, the age-related decline and death, is a medical problem that we can overcome through technological means, and that we're not working at overcoming senescence anything like hard enough. And then in the sixth week, we're going to turn to ancient India and look at the Katha Upanishad, which is framed by the story of a young boy coming before the Lord of Death and asking Yama, the Lord of Death, what happens to somebody after death? And what follows is a poetic and philosophical account of the idea that there is something more to the self than this individual person that we take ourselves to be, and that after death we can come to a greater merging with this larger self of Atman. In the third unit of the course, we're going to look at the question of how death and mortality shape our sense of the meaning of our life. And we're going to start in the 7th week with excerpts from Samuel Scheffler's book, Death and the Afterlife. Scheffler invites us to imagine a world in which, maybe a month after our own demise, the entire human race goes extinct. And he asks, if you knew that was going to happen, how might that affect the sense that you bring to what's worth doing in your own life? And Scheffler argues that thinking about things in these terms reveals that our own continued existence matters to us far less than we ordinarily suppose, and that the continued existence of other people matters far more. In the 8th week, we're going to turn to the chapter on death in Martin Heidegger's book, Being and Time. Being and Time is one of the landmarks of 20th century philosophy. It's also one of the most difficult works of 20th century philosophy. But it's a work I've spent a lot of time doing research on, and I look forward to being able to provide some guidance in working through the difficult tangles in Heidegger's philosophy. Heidegger argues that human existence is fundamentally structured by what he calls being towards death, that our sense of our lives as closed off by death gives our lives the meaning that it has, and that the strong temptation to avoid a confrontation with our mortality precludes living authentically. In the final unit of the course, I want to look at the ways in which close encounters with death might shape or reshape our understanding of our lives. So in the 9th week, we'll take a look at Denise Riley's Time Lived Without Its Flow. Riley is a poet and a philosopher who suffered the loss of her own son, and describes how that period of grief was one in which her sense of time was severely disrupted, and she became aware of time, the medium in which our lives unfold, in a radically new way. And then in the 10th and final week, we're going to look at some reflections by the eco-feminist philosopher Val Plumwood after she narrowly survived an attack by a crocodile in the Australian outback. That experience of being seen as prey, seen as meat, shaped the way that Plumwood understood herself in relation to the broader flow of existence and her place as an animal within an ecosystem. There are 4 components to this course. The first is that there will be 10 readings that I will provide in PDF format that you can access through the course website. I'm also going to build, and this is the second component, a weekly video lecture that unpacks the readings, helps frame them for you, and sets up some questions for discussion. The third component, I think the main one, is that we're going to meet once a week over Zoom, and we will spend 75 minutes discussing the material together. And this will be a discussion that's partly shaped by the questions I put into my video lecture, as well as questions that you want to bring in for further discussion. And then the 4th element of the course is that I will set up on Slack a messaging system so that people can discuss the material in the course offline outside of the discussion class hours. The fee for the course is 375 Canadian dollars, and that includes GST if you're a Canadian resident. That works out to about 275 US dollars or 255 euro or about 220 British pounds, depending on the exchange rate the day that you make your booking. But I also want to make sure that the course is accessible for everyone. And for that reason, I also offer a pay what you can option for those who can't afford the full course fee. If you don't think you can afford the course fee but are very interested in the course, just let me know. I'd be very happy to accommodate you. I also have a full refund up to the 2nd week of the class. So you can try out the 1st week of the class, see if it's for you. If it isn't quite for you, that's no problem. Just let me know. I'll give you a full refund. No problem. I do very much hope that you will enjoy the class, though, and I'm very much looking forward to sharing this material with you. Life is short, and I hope you'll take advantage of this opportunity to join me.